Today we're going to be taking a closer look at an extremely unusual pixel gun version. Across the 13 years that Pixel Gun 3D has been out, countless updates were released. But at a time where almost every update seemed to make the game worse, version 18.0 would be an extremely rare case of the community providing a mostly positive response. Despite the positive feedback, this update would be reverted soon after. But why? In this video, we're going to figure out what made this update so loved. Was it due to it being the first attempt at reducing pay-to-win features? By the end, you'll understand exactly why this version is commonly referred to as the best update ever. And I'll leave it up to you to decide if reverting these changes was the right decision. Before we get into the specific features and changes that ultimately made this release one of the best, bringing the game the closest it's ever been to fixed, it's important to understand the overall community sentiment and state of the game leading up to the 2020 release of the 18.0 update. The versions prior to 18.0 were version 17.0 to 17.8.2, which would last from December of 2019 to July 10th of 2020. Versions like 17.0 were extremely lackluster in comparison to what we would see in 18.0, despite it being referred to as the biggest update in Pixel Gun history, since most of the changes were regarding the max level being changed to 65, clans, or the Battle Royale mode, with the core gameplay and features being left alone for the most part, which led to the community collectively deciding the developers were no longer focused on improving the actual gameplay, or addressing any of the complaints regarding the influx of pay-to-win features. This theory was supported by the fact that the only updates and content that were added during this time consisted of various lottery events, currency, and Battle Pass exclusive content. As a result, over the course of these updates, many players felt like the game was declining, which would be reinforced by the community's sentiment only worsening. All of this combined basically forced the developers into an ultimatum. They could either continue releasing greedy, money-driven updates, which would make them money, but only contribute to the declining player count, or they could take a step back and not only listen to the community's feedback, but work towards solutions to those complaints. Surprisingly, they would choose the latter, with their decision made clear on July 27th of 2020, when version 18.0 would be officially released. One of the biggest complaints from the community at the time was regarding how it was becoming increasingly difficult to compete without spending real-world money on things like the Battle Pass or currency in general. However, the 18.0 update would actually make an effort to find a fix, with one of the biggest improvements being to the chest system. Version 18.0 would introduce a new approach to the reward system, making it so players were rewarded for not only playing matches, but playing consistently, with 3 different chests being obtainable. The easiest chest to unlock being the small chest, which was unlocked by obtaining 100 keys from playing matches or daily rewards. Then the king chest, which was unlocked by collecting king keys, which were earned for every victory in a public match. And finally the lottery themed chest, which we'll come back to later. The only difference between the chests being the amount of parts and currency received. Depending on what chest you opened, you would also receive 25 to 75 card keys, which basically served as a cashback system, since after collecting 1000 card keys, you would unlock a free super chest. Instead of rewarding you with weapon parts, you would be able to obtain an entire weapon. Obviously, the intention of this full rework was to make it easier for free-to-play players to actually obtain event weapons and rewards, since prior to this, it was nearly impossible to unbox enough chests to craft event weapons without spending real-world money. However, the changes wouldn't stop with lottery events. Instead of rewarding only the players willing to spend money, version 18.0 finally started rewarding players for simply playing the game, which had been one of the most common requests from the community. The new chest system alone serves as a perfect example of what made 18.0 feel so different from the rest, since instead of repeating the cycle of releasing only monetization-driven updates, the developers were actually thinking about improving the core gameplay, and finally making in-app purchases feel like a secondary option. While the trophy system wasn't the center of attention when it came to criticism, like we saw with the lottery system, it would still end up being met with complaints from the community, since it gave players basically relatively little to no incentive to actually grind, with the only rewards being some weapon skins and an extremely small amount of gems. One of the most major changes in 18.0 would be removing the old trophy rank system entirely, replacing them with the trophy road. In this new system, your rank was determined by how many dog tags were earned before the end of the season. The rewards you earned were based on progress milestones along the trophy road, with the prizes ranging anywhere from complete weapons, currency, or chests. It's fair to say the community was pretty much in favor of this change, as it really had no downsides, and it only helped make the game more balanced for everyone, more specifically free-to-play players. Like we've already covered, 18.0 was obviously addressing the elephant in the room, that being the pay-to-win complaints. But the matchmaking system was still long overdue for an update, since it had basically remained the same since its release all the way back in 2013. With that being said, we would see a pretty major change in the way public matches were structured, but you'll see how it would eventually prove to be a double-edged sword. Whereas in previous versions, and even today, joining a random public match meant you could join at any time, whether it was 20 seconds into the match or just 10 seconds before the match ended. That wasn't the case in 18.0, since the developers would implement a pre-game lobby, where all the spots had to be filled before the match would actually start. Once the match did begin, if a player were to leave, their spot wouldn't just open up for another player to join. Their spot would be taken by an AI until they joined back or the game inevitably ended. The end of matches would be reworked as well, taking you back to the pre-game lobby at the end of a match, and displaying each player's performance, ranks, as well as a much more detailed breakdown of the rewards you earned. The community would be pretty split on this change, since half were glad they didn't have to worry about joining games right before they ended or joining lobbies with only 1 to 2 players, and the other half not being in favor of this change, since it meant no longer being able to join a friend's lobby randomly, as well as longer matchmaking times in general. While the feature that replaced players with a bot in the event they disconnected from a match was advertised as something new, bots did exist prior to this. Despite people commonly referring to this version as the start of the bot problem, if 18.0 played any role, it only proved to the developers that the players didn't really take issue with the fact that their opponents weren't always real people. But feel free to debate that in the comments. Up until this point, 18.0 finally felt like the developers were trying to push the game in the right direction. Free-to-play players now actually had ways to earn weapons and currency, the progression system finally rewarded players for grinding, and public matches felt far more alive and structured than ever. For the first time in a very long time, the community felt like the developers were actually listening to the feedback, instead of just pushing out more greed-driven content. Despite all of the improvements that came with version 18.0, one specific feature would quickly become the center of debate. Prior to this update, players had complete freedom over what modes and maps they would play. However, in 18.0 that would completely change, with the introduction of the rotating modes and map system. Rather than every game mode being available simultaneously, the game would instead only allow access to a small selection of maps or modes at a time, with them rotating in and out every couple of hours. It was pretty obvious that this was done in order to keep the player base more concentrated into a smaller playlist of modes and maps, in turn improving matchmaking times and helping fill lobbies more consistently, which, to be fair, did actually work initially. While the system did technically improve matchmaking, it would create an entirely different problem, since now players were essentially being forced to play whatever modes the game decided to make available that day, which proved to be an issue when your favorite mode wasn't active. Your only real option was either waiting hours for the modes to refresh or just not play at all. This problem was made even more frustrating due to Battle Pass challenges sometimes requiring specific game modes or maps that simply just weren't available at the time. This would end up becoming one of the few but very major criticisms surrounding version 18.0. Some players believed limiting modes was necessary for improving matchmaking and making the game feel more alive. Others argued that the developers had solved one problem by creating another, since the game basically removed the players' freedom to actually choose how they wanted to play. And looking back, this controversy may have played a much bigger role in the eventual removal of the update than most people realize. While the rotating modes may have been the center of attention and taken the spotlight from everything else, there was a pretty interesting set of content released alongside 18.0 that was mostly overlooked as a result. The Game Developer Battle Pass introduced a set of new items and weapons, including the debugger, the stupid pet hamster Zazu, killer cord, and the like booster. However, compared to the lottery event weapons, they weren't nearly as unique. Alongside this, the creatively named Game Developer Lottery introduced a completely separate pool of developer-themed items, like the digital drawing pad, banhammer, render station, VR blasters, Gunforce PGX, good code, and developer armor. With the obvious theme of this update being game development, a new map would be added as well, named Pixel Gun Office, which is surprisingly a pretty well-made map in terms of attention to detail. Just taking a look around the map, there's an endless amount of Easter eggs, like the prop room where you can see the various assets from the old shooting range, the TV screens throughout the office displaying different maps, or the posters on the walls from Scary Pizzeria and Paradise Resort. There's an overwhelming amount of details in this map, and could get an entire video on its own. While Pixel Gun Office was the only new map to be added, we would see two much older maps being added back, which were Science Lab and Inside the Code. At this point, had been out of the game for nearly 5 years. This update was obviously trying to push the game forward mechanically. It was also leaning pretty heavily into nostalgia, most likely to hopefully bring back the older players that had already quit the game. Taking a look at the 18.0 version as a whole, from the completely reworked chest system and overall significant increase of free-to-play rewards, even the smaller changes regarding the pre- and post-game lobbies, all around just gave the game a much more polished and modern feel. Those improvements were what made this release stand out from all of the others, since it actually felt like the developers were listening to the community and trying to find a middle ground between increasing profits but still creating a better player experience. However, it's important to acknowledge the flaws that were brought with this update, since they provide a lot more insight as to why it may have been ultimately reverted, despite the overwhelmingly positive community response. Unfortunately, most of the improvements did have a caveat, like in the case of the new matchmaking system keeping lobbies full, which would be at the cost of players' freedom. The major changes seen in 18.0 would be reverted entirely on September 3rd of 2020, come version 18.1, with the game returning to the old matchmaking structure and progression system. I think it's hard to say if this update should or should not have been reverted, because there are clear benefits to the changes, but there's also undeniable flaws. Do you think reverting the 18.0 update was the right decision? Or was it worth sacrificing freedom for a better overall structure? If you made it this far in the video, you should totally subscribe for more high quality content just like this. And if you do want to support the channel, I opened up channel memberships. They give you access to member only content and priority replies to your comments. And if you want another video to watch, you should watch this one. YouTube says you should watch it. You have to watch it. Alright. My dog. Goodbye.